Well, happy Monday and hello everyone. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. Well, this morning I'm getting back to my reading. I think I'm on about part number 8 or 9 of Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy, Volume 1 by Anton Chaikin, a gentleman who's been my guest twice on the show now, and I'm looking forward to the next time. Um, uh, if you want to get some background on, the real history of the United States, look into Anton Chaikin's work. You can find him on the Saker, Saker, where a lot of his more recent work is. Older stuff, and is really valuable too, on Executive Intelligence Review, which you can find at larouchepub.com. Well, speaking of LaRouche, the LaRouche candidate Diane Sayre will be joining us Thursday evening at 8 p.m. To talk about her amazingly vibrant candidacy for the Senate seat held now by Senator Chuck Schumer. So I'm doing a show with her. I'm very grateful and honored that she took uh, a time out of this last week before the big election to spend some time with us at McDuff Lives. Tonight, Bill Taylor will be with me at 8 p.m. and tomorrow at 11 a.m., another special new guest, Dr. Dolores Cahill of Ireland, an early whistleblower in the so-called pandemic, and someone who has a real important message for us all. So tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. From Ireland, Dr. Dolores Cahill. And again, she was very visible early in the pandemic as a whistleblower and a person who of the proper credentials to criticize. And that resulted in her, of course, being banned just about everywhere on social media. So we are very honored to bring her to you tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Well, we've moved through a lot of Anton Chaikin's book here, the Who We Are, which was published in 2020. And he is very actively at work on his next volume of this history. This volume takes us up to 1850, and it's a part of the history of this country that probably a lot of people skip over because they want to get to the Civil War, right? And see the military and the speeches and the bravado and the bunting and parades and get into that. But these last 3 decades before the Civil War are where American progress really lifted off. So that is, in fact, the title of Chapter 9 of Mr. Chaikin's book. And we have read part of it, Lift Off, up to page 30. Let's see, where are we at? 327 is where we left off. So we've talked about the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and how it was a joint government, military, and financial venture. And the next section of this part of the book is called The Foundry Powers, the Trains. The foundry. What foundry? Who made the trains? Well, that's the story. The first railroad locomotives manufactured in the United States were built by the West Point Foundry, established in 1817 as a privately owned enterprise closely connected to the U.S. Military Academy and the U.S. War and Navy departments, for whom it produced artillery. The foundry, quote, made more than armaments. It was one of the few places in the nation that combined heavy iron casting, machining, and forging work to produce the largest classes of steam engines and industrial equipment. In any given month, the WPF, that is the foundry, could finish machinery for water powered mills, blowing engines for blast furnaces, stationary steam engines in a wide range of sizes, marine engines for river, coastal, lake, and ocean-going vessels, or the first American-built railway locomotives. Professor James Renwick, the Foundries co-initiator with Swift and Kimball, brought it into the railroad business. Renwick and former Erie Canal engineer John B. Jervis were advising the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, the D&H, on its project to connect coal mines by a railway and then a waterway up through northeastern Pennsylvania to the Hudson River at Round Out, about 35 miles north of West Point. Jervis arranged to buy a locomotive, dubbed the Stourbridge Lion, from the English firm Foster Rastrick and Company for delivery to New York City. On May 28, 1829, it was tested up on blocks at the West Point Foundries machine shop on Beach Street. It was then shipped up the Hudson and down the canal to D&H headquarters at Honesville, Pennsylvania. The British Lion went into experimental service as the first locomotive on an American route, but it was too heavy for the rails and was never used productively. Jervis and Renwick went on to engineer New York State's first railway, the Mohawk and Hudson, for which the West Point Foundry would do pioneering work. Meanwhile, the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company commissioned the West Point Foundry to produce a locomotive for its projected line from the Atlantic port of Charleston, 136 miles westward to Hamburg on the Savannah River opposite Augusta, Georgia. The machine was built at the Foundry's New York City shop. It was delivered in October 1830, and its admirers gave it the name Best Friend of Charleston. While the Baltimore and Ohio was initially using horse-drawn carriages on its rails, the Foundry's first in-service American locomotive pulled passenger cars about 25 miles from Charleston to Dorchester on Christmas Day, 1830, exceeding expectations at speeds of 15 to 25 miles per hour. Just as in the early American space program, the pioneering railroad technology had its setbacks, with ultimate success. After 6 months in operation, the Best Friend of Charleston exploded when the firemen closed the boiler's safety valve to stop its annoying sound. The when you ever turn off the dings in your car, you know how this guy felt, right? Okay. The railroad said it would place a barrier car between the engine and passenger cars. Quote, loaded with 6 bales of cotton, it will protect travelers when the locomotive explodes, unquote. From the Best Friend's mangled parts, a replacement locomotive was put into service called the Phoenix. Oh boy, what a name, huh? Which worked quite well until the Civil War in the 1860s. So there you have it. The Phoenix rises from the ashes of the old Best Friend of Charleston. The West Point Foundry sent to South Carolina a second locomotive called the West Point, ordered before the explosion, with a horizontal rather than a vertical boiler to pass more easily under bridges. When the railroad company's chief engineer, Horatio Allen, designed a double-ended locomotive called the South Carolina, built by the West Point Foundry, with 2 boilers, a single firebox between them, and a smokestack at each end, it was a fiasco, constantly needing repair, and was soon abandoned. In 1828, James Renwick became the secretary of the projected Mohawk and Hudson Railroad under its president, Stephen Van Rensselaer. They brought in as chief engineer John Jervis, with whom Renwick had worked on a D&H project. Jervis designed the third locomotive to be built in the West Point Foundry, named the DeWitt Clinton, which was ordered in March 1831 by the then uncompleted Mohawk and Hudson. Professor Renwick's consultation with Jervis ensured success for the enterprise. Renwick's treatise on the steam engine, published the previous year, demonstrated his world-leading authority on the history, scientific principles, manufacturing, and employment of steam technology. The new locomotive was astonishing. On August 9, 1831, quote, the DeWitt Clinton, attached to a train of cars, passed over the road from one elevation to another, to the delight of a large crowd assembled to witness the performance. The engine performed the entire route in less than an hour, including stoppages, and on part of the road, its speed was at the rate of 30 miles an hour. Unquote. A second excursion soon afterward was completed in 50 minutes, carrying as a passenger General Winfield Scott, an intimate of the West Point Foundry management. A year later, a new West Point Foundry locomotive designed by John Jervis was tested on the Mohawk and Hudson track. It would revolutionize global railroad technology. Initially called the Experiment, later renamed Brother Jonathan, it was the first engine to have wheels on a leading swiveling truck, known as a bogie. Quote, this radically changed the four-square rigid British plan. An employee of the West Point Foundry tested the engine for speed in August 1832 with remarkable results. He said she was, quote, the fastest and steadiest engine I have ever run. 14 miles, including one stop for water, was made in 13 minutes, and 1 mile was clocked in only 45 seconds. In this at 80 miles an hour. In the time when the horse was man's fastest courier, this test was miraculous. Yet surely these racing trips were rare because trains on the Mohawk and Hudson were operated at 19 miles an hour in respect to safety and economy. The locomotive, later rebuilt and enlarged, was in service for over 20 years. The West Point Foundry made about 1/3 of all U.S. artillery up through the Civil War, including the famous deadly effective rifled Parrott guns. Thus, when Jules Verne celebrated America's ability to do anything with technology in his 1865 novel From the Earth to the Moon, he made the West Point Foundry the fictional producer of the gigantic cannon that fired the spacecraft and its voyagers to accomplish the mission. Next few pages are some really nice illustrations. And then we're on to chapter 10, the Philadelphia Base for Universal Progress. A unique complex of institutions with a common dedication to national advancement arose in Philadelphia in the 1820s and succeeding decades. We will examine how leaders associated with this combination of public and private organizations sustained the push for U.S. industrialization after the 1829 termination of the Adams administration and thus beyond the era of nationalist top-down power in the federal government. Philadelphia's role as the base and the motor for progress grew from Benjamin Franklin's political and civic guidance, and from the city having been the headquarters of the Revolution and its nation's capital before 1800. Here was the science-leading American Philosophical Society and University of Pennsylvania, both established by Franklin in the 1740s, the Bank of the United States, created by the Philadelphia resident administration of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, revived in 1816 and led by Philadelphian Nicholas Biddle in the 1820s and 1830s, and the Franklin Institute and other organizations to promote industry and infrastructure organized in the upsurge of nationalist politics from 1819 to 1824. Here also, since colonial days, were excellent machining and metalworking shops and iron forges. The Franklin Institute took up the task of training many of their inventive and prosperous workers and leadership cadres. I like the idea of prosperous workers, don't you? Foreign peoples aspiring to emulate and ally with the progressing American Republic continue to maintain consulates and other important agencies in Philadelphia, the center of nationalist strategy, as they had in the 1790s when it was the capital of the U.S. And Philadelphians eagerly sought the development of other nations, potential allies, and trading partners who should be freed from the economic suppression of European imperialism, particularly British. The Philadelphia Center gave powerful impetus to three American industries born in the 1820s and 1830s: railroads, coal mining, and modern iron forging. As will be seen, these initiatives were closely related and tightly interdependent. Their success was largely the product of the nation building goals of their strategists. We will here present certain widely influential enterprises stemming from the identified Philadelphia institutional base: the Reading Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad, three Philadelphia locomotive manufacturers, and American initiatives to develop Russia and Germany. Pardon me a moment. The Reading Railroad and the National Bank. Nicholas Biddle conceived of the Reading Railroad as a national asset, a conveyor belt for the anthracite coal that could power spectacular U.S. industrial growth. The Reading, as it came to be known, eventually consolidated transportation throughout the coal mining region and ran its own fleet of ocean freighters for global coal exports. It was perhaps the world's largest corporation by 1871 in terms of stock share value. Isn't that interesting? This is a tie-in that's going to tie into our work that will be the next book we focus on, A Law Unto Itself, The Untold Story of the Law Firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. So now we're really making a connection to what I think is one of the great tragedies of American law, and that is the creation of perpetual corporations and holding companies. So here we are. The biggest corporation, 1871, is the Reading Railroad. Let's see where it goes from here. The company was Biddle's own project, organized from the outset through his family and agents. The Pennsylvania legislature chartered the Philadelphia and Reading, name later shortened to Reading Railroad, in 1833. Nicholas Biddle and his associates sustained the line's construction from 1835 through the 1837 to 42 economic depression caused by Jackson and Van Buren's policies. I'm going to read this footnote because I think the financing is always important. Footnote 3: on October 22nd, 1836, the company secured a loan of $1 million guaranteed by a mortgage to Thomas A. Biddle and to Samuel Jaudon, Jaudon, a Reading company manager who was cashier of the Bank of the United States and lieutenant to Nicholas Biddle. Okay. And note 4, the Jackson-Van Buren War against the Bank of the United States blocked the bank's federal rechartering in 1836. However, it gained a new charter from the state of Pennsylvania. Okay, so the Bank of the U.S. is really a Pennsylvania institution by 1836. Fascinating. The national bank led by Biddle was the primary financial agency responsible for early development of American railroads. The Reading's main line was completed in 1842 from the mining town of Pottsville through Reading to Port Richmond, the company's wharf center near Philadelphia. This was the first all-rail link between the Pennsylvania coal regions and the Delaware River. 2 years later, the Reading was the first U.S. railroad to haul 1 million tons of freight. The character of Philadelphia's intellectual-industrial complex is illustrated by the example of the creative scientist William Hippolytus Keating, who served as the Reading Railroad's founding legal counsel and manager. Keating was an attorney as well as a professor of chemistry and geology at the University of Pennsylvania, the science advisor on Stephen Long's 1823 Great Lakes expedition, an activist and officer of the American Philosophical Society, and a co-founder of the Franklin Institute. Keating died in 1840 in London while seeking funding for the hard-pressed Reading Railroad project. The National Bank I'm sorry, I read that. A Harvard University business historian wrote that, quote, the Biddles did much to give Philadelphia her primacy in railroad finance during the 1830s. Thomas Biddle helped to market the securities of the Reading Railroad and the Virginia railroads. The Bank of the United States acted as a fiscal agent for the Reading and other coal railroads. When the bank failed in 1840, it had large holdings in nearly all the important privately financed rail lines south of New York. Biddle and his Philadelphia associates were stalwart American protectionists, advocating high tariffs to block cheap British imports that undercut U.S. industry, and advocating high wages, which came from flourishing, skilled employment. A political irony of this era is that the British were of two minds about the Americans. The Baring Bank acted as financial agent in England for the Bank of the United States. And British middle class capitalists loved Biddle and the bank because they made good money from sound investments in Biddle promoted railroads and industries. But London's financial partners in Wall Street, Baring's U.S. agent, and this is the name of a company, Prime, Ward and King, and in the other company, and this one we know the name already, right? Brown Brothers and Company, supported President Jackson's attacks on the Bank of the United States. I I have to stop and say this is this is so important. This is like tying together the sinews of a long, long narrative that I'm working on to try to explain what's really, really going on. I know I'm not the first person to try this, but think about the influence of Brown Brothers Harriman today. All of this goes back to the old Brown Brothers, and what were they but merchants for the cotton plantations? I mean, they were financing and exporting the cotton at profit as part of the British Empire and using our land and our people, our enslaved people, and basically every other person that was associated with the plantations in order to enhance the wealth of whom? Not of us, but of the London and Wall Street financial interests that we still are plagued by today when you think about our disastrous foreign policy and our disastrous financial policy. So, this to me is a very, very important part of my study is to hear this. London's financial partners in Wall Street supported President Jackson's attacks on the Bank of the United States. Now, I know President Jackson is a hero to a lot of people, and I think, he was sincere in thinking that he was doing the right thing. But in this country, if we wanted to remain sovereign, we needed to fight against those British financial interests that were inhabiting, the city of London and Wall Street as they do today. Okay, enough out of me. And the Bank of England put the screws on the American economy in 1837 by forcing British firms, including Barings, to cut American investments. With the flow of credit to industry no longer protected by the Bank of the United States after Jackson blew it up, this British pressure precipitated a Great Depression and mass unemployment in the USA. Philadelphia, the locomotive capital, though steam engine power was foreseen for American railroads then being designed, service began on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in May 1830 with only horse-drawn carriages. That year, the British success in the opening of the Manchester and Liverpool Railway and the first excursion run of the West Point Foundries machine in South Carolina spurred U.S. commercial interest to build locomotives. 3 companies were established in Philadelphia that shaped subsequent manufacturing in this field: Norris Locomotive Works, Baldwin Locomotive Works, and Eastwick and Harrison. U.S. Army officer Stephen H. Long, which was the first partner of Norris Locomotive Works, began designing locomotives in 1829 while still working on the Baltimore and Ohio project. Pennsylvania chartered Long's own, quote, American Steam Carriage Company in March 1830. An engine he produced got its first trial July 4th, 1831, on the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad, then under construction in Delaware. That machine was not powerful enough and was withdrawn. Long attempted to run his locomotives on anthracite coal. It burned at a high temperature and could not then be controlled as well as wood, so wood was the fuel that powered virtually all early U.S. locomotives. The country's iron forging had the same technical problem, and both railways and iron manufacture later advanced rapidly when Americans finally mastered anthracite use in steam boilers and forges. Soft, that is, bituminous coal, was readily available in Britain but was not yet developed in U.S. industrial regions. This added to the British head start over American industrial development. Stephen Long persisted, going into business with William Norris and producing a few more locomotives with mediocre results. Lieutenant Colonel Long withdrew in 1834, but his drive and creativity set the pace for what became the Norris family firm. Their 1836 locomotive, named the George Washington, was a stunning success. Designed to concentrate its own total weight and that of its tender car on its driving wheels, it ran up a 14-degree slope, drawing 9 tons behind the engine at 15 miles per hour. This performance made the company famous and began a quarter century of the Norris firm's dominance of U.S. locomotive production, with 1,000 units sold in the U.S., Europe, and South America by the time of the American Civil War. Matthias Baldwin. Matthias Baldwin's enterprise eventually surpassed Norris's, and he became the nation's outstanding producer of locomotives. Baldwin was an inventive Philadelphia jewelry maker who co-founded the Franklin Institute with Matthew Carey and others in 1824. The following year, he formed a business to produce industrial machinery, soon designed a steam engine to power his shop, and then began manufacturing and selling steam engines. Baldwin's subsequent role in national progress can only be properly understood in connection with the Franklin Institute, which coordinated and catalyzed the efforts of the 19th century technological pioneers. It was the central agency for analyzing every component of America's industrialization: steam engines, locomotives, steamboats, the coal and iron industries, and the exciting investigations then being done on electricity. The work of the Public Institute, which overlapped extensively with Baldwin's and other private enterprises, was inspired and energized by Alexander Dallas Bache, that's Bache, a brilliant young University of Pennsylvania science professor. He was a great-grandson of Benjamin Franklin and a grandson of former Treasury Secretary Alexander J. Dallas. Bache graduated as an Army engineer, ranking first in the West Point class of 1825, that heady year when President Adams declared government responsible for mankind's elevation. Isn't that interesting? You know, we still today fight over whether government should be directing the economy or should be stepping aside to let private industry do it. But it's not a new debate at all. With of course, we have George Washington's word on that as well as that of the uh, of the Philadelphians. So John Quincy Adams has said it. Government is responsible for mankind's elevation. In 1828, Nicholas Biddle, then the chairman of faculty nominations at the University of Pennsylvania, invited Lieutenant Bache to return to Philadelphia to be a professor of natural philosophy and chemistry. The Franklin Institute conducted vital federally funded research, don't you love those federal dollars, into the causes of steam boiler explosions. This work was led by the Institute co-founders William H. Keating, Samuel Vaughan Merrick, and Matthias Baldwin. all of them later to be railroad pioneers, and by Alexander Dallas Besh, who became the director of this steam engine research. Of Besh, we will hear more toward the close of this chapter. It was another leader of the Franklin Institute, Benjamin Franklin Peale, who brought Matthias Baldwin into the locomotive business. Peale taught mechanics and natural science at the Institute and managed the Science Museum, the Philadelphia Museum, housed at the American Philosophical Society. He got his friend Baldwin to make a locomotive, notably Pennsylvania's first, a miniature that carried visitors in two cars on tracks laid around the museum. Don't you love those little trains? You know, when I was growing up down here in Charles County, Maryland, we had a, a uh, a place called Marshall Hall, which was an amusement park. And we had a family, well, it was my parents and my sister and I. It was before my little sister was born, but we once or twice a summer, it was the happiest day of the year for us kids that Daddy would say, okay, get in the car, we're going to Marshall Hall Park. And at the end of the evening, where you walk around and visit the different arcades and just be dazzled as children with all the flashing lights and machines. And um, the park had a train that ran around it, the exterior of it. And that little train is one of the most iconic memories I have. These little trains, they mean a lot, don't they? When Stephen Long's machine failed on the Delaware Railway, they replaced it with two Stephenson locomotives from England, and Baldwin was assigned to study and assemble them upon delivery. Baldwin then jumped into locomotive making. I wonder how he got the technology. And Franklin Peale helped him launch the business. Baldwin's successful machine, Old Ironsides, with a newly invented reversing device, went into the service of the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown Railroad in November 1832. Orders now poured in to Baldwin's shop. Baldwin Locomotive Works grew to be the world's premier industrial concern, the greatest source of capital goods for developing nations. It produced 70,000 locomotives. The best of the American national character was shown in the skilled workers at the Baldwin plant and in those workers who went abroad to deliver and set up their product in South America or Asia. A man's job might have begun as a youth in the apprenticeship program, where he learned from the world's finest craftsmen. He took pride that he could take apart and put together the locomotive's thousands of parts, whether in a foreign country or back home. Matthias Baldwin's mental life typified Philadelphia's creative leadership. He underwrote the first U.S. production of Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute, by the Musical Fund Society on February 8th, 1841. And of course, that's an opera that I have sung in myself as Sarastro. And it's one of the most important works of art of, well, any time. Garrett, Eastwick, and Harrison, the third of Philadelphia's early locomotive manufacturing enterprises, entered this line of business in 1835 after Norris and Baldwin had shown the way. The new firm, Garrett and Eastwick, would be instrumental in one of the great transformative projects of world history. The machine building partnership of Philip C. Garrett and Andrew M. Eastwick procured an order for a new railroad in coal-rich northeastern Pennsylvania and hired master mechanic Joseph Harrison Jr. as foreman on the job. Harrison had been a journeyman for 2 years at the Long and Norris Works. Garrett and Eastwick's locomotive design for the Beaver Meadow Railroad, with a shelter for the fireman and engine man, later developed into the enclosed cab, and an improved reversing device brought more railway orders for the firm. A second locomotive for the Beaver Meadow, the Hercules, combined the first use of a four-wheel leading truck to negotiate in difficult turns with Harrison's invention of an equalizing lever to distribute the weight on all wheels for better traction. necessities in coal country with rough rails and steep grades. The young mechanic became a partner, and the firm reorganized as Eastwick and Harrison. In the summer of 1839, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad gave Eastwick and Harrison an order for a heavy-duty freight locomotive. It came in the depths of the Free Trade Depression, when Biddle was forced to scrounge in London for investment funds for the railway. Harrison's machine for the Reading was called the Gowan and Marks, named after a London banking firm that channeled funds into some of Biddle's projects. The Harrison design reset the placement of the driving wheels, and with the Harrison equalizing lever, gave the locomotive astonishing power. Quote, on one of its trips, February 20th, 1840, it drew a train of 101 four-wheel loaded cars from Reading to Philadelphia. The gross weight equaled 40 times the weight of the engine. The Franklin Institute immediately publicized this feat of American engineering, printing the report of the Reading Railroad superintendent, which concluded, quote, the above performance of an 11-ton engine is believed to excel any on record in this or any other country, unquote. Harrison, Whistler, and the U.S.-Russian alliance. Again, here's resonance today. Why wouldn't it be the most natural alliance of the United States and Russia? But again, London and Wall Street veto it and fight it. The new Harrison locomotive drew the attentions of two representatives of the Russian government who were in the United States seeking appropriate designs and expert personnel to build their country's first great railroad. Russia at the time had only a short railway of 18 miles. The Tsar, Emperor Nicholas I, wanted to break into modern times with a rail line connecting the new capital, St. Petersburg, with the ancient capital, Moscow, which was 440 miles away. Colonels Pavel Petrovich Melnikov and Nikolai Osipovich Kraft had left Russia. They met with former Army officer George Washington Whistler, then the chief engineer for building the Western Railroad of Massachusetts. After the Russians returned home in the autumn of 1840, their reports were favorable to Whistler's credentials as well as to Harrison's locomotives. In 1842, Emperor Nicholas asked Whistler to superintend construction of the projected Russian railway. Harrison was engaged to build in Russia the factory to supply the locomotives and cars. Harrison formed for this purpose a new firm with Eastwick and Thomas Winans. This epochal U.S.-Russian enterprise significantly shifted world history, proving the power of both countries to accomplish heroic tasks. American aid in elevating Russia out of feudalism was based on a strategic friendship between the two countries since the American Revolution, a tie solidified by John Quincy Adams as ambassador to St. Petersburg. In 1841, it was the new American ambassador Charles S. Todd whose consultations with the Tsar helped induce him to choose Whistler and the Harrison firm to build the railway. Ambassador Todd later explained the thinking of America's best senior leaders concerning the Russian project. And this is a long quotation. There was frequent allusion in the St. Petersburg Journal to our country as a great maritime power. Emperor Nicholas's estimate of our capacity, of our power, is chiefly regulated by his conviction of our ability to contend for the freedom of the seas, of which Great Britain arrogantly assumes to be the mistress. Like our own beloved land, Russia is the child of the 18th century. In the last 100 years, she has advanced as rapidly as her neighbors in all that constitutes the strength of a state, if we accept the results which flow only from the diffusion of intelligence among the masses. Like our own country, she is formidable in her offensive as well as defensive attitude. She, by her isolated position and gigantic army, he's talking, of course, of the United States, were we, by our extended coast and efficient marine, under a proper system of agriculture, I'm sorry, I'm misunderstanding it. She is talking about Russia as she. Under a proper system of agriculture, she, like the United States, possesses ample means for feeding her own people and of contributing to the wants of other nations. In all substantial respects, the two powers are the most independent on the globe. And I just have to stop again and make a comment. The Tsar Nicholas sees the importance of the nation feeding its own people. The Americans saw the importance of feeding their own people. But corporations have come in and made food a universal product that depends upon transportation from, all the other continents of the world just to make it into my local grocery store to feed me. And that is by its nature supporting the British imperial system because it's transportation that bears the real expense of it. And we subsidize that with our taxes, with our building programs, with our military. Whereas if we were feeding ourselves, then we would be sovereign. But by not feeding ourselves, by turning our backs on this universally recognized principle that a nation should be able to feed itself before it tries to go out and contribute to the wants of other nations. And I think we could solve an awful lot of the problems that we have today. Good food for good people, grown locally, or at least knowing that you have sufficient food here. You can import, but only once you're sure that you have food security. And it is food insecurity that is being used as a weapon against the people of the world right now. Okay, rant number 2 is over. Continuing the quote, and this again from, okay, I'm sorry. This is Ambassador Todd, the American ambassador to the Russian government in St. Petersburg. And he continues, the power of steam is working wonders in both. Railroads will give them permanent tranquility, for in the concentrated means of war are found the surest guarantees of peace. The capacity with which their internal facilities afford for quickly sending a large military force from the interior to the frontier will preserve both from invasion, while in Russia, the vast railroad contemplated by the emperor for uniting the Baltic with the Black Sea and the Caspian will give him the power to invade the contiguous nations at the same time his standing army, permitted from the power of sudden concentration to be reduced in numbers and expense, is engaged in preserving the public peace at home. With this interesting nation, we have always maintained a friendly intercourse. It is a sublime spectacle worthy of the contemplation of other powers to see two great nations, the most extensive in territory and resources in the old and new world, always living in peace. Wouldn't that be nice? May I renew to you an expression of the sentiment which I indulged in my last interview with the Emperor, that the day might soon arrive when the power of the United States and Russia by sea and land should be such as to command all the nations of the earth to be at peace. Unquote. And that's Ambassador Todd. Now back to our text by Anton Chaikin. We learn from General Joseph Gardner Swift's memoirs that early in 1842, Swift was helping Whistler with the organization of the Massachusetts Railroad when Whistler received the invitation to go to Russia. Swift and Whistler went together to Washington. They met with Russia's ambassador, Alexander Bodisko, on May the 8th and arranged, quote, for Whistler's service at $12,000 a year. Quote, had with Mr. Bodisco an interesting conversation on the difficulties of a Russian campaign across the Indus River and the sands up to India and of its inutility, while England had the supremacy of naval power. Accepting the assignment, Whistler arrived in St. Petersburg late in the summer of 1842 and began reconnoitering the vast, muddy expanse down to Moscow. Harrison arrived later, and his factory operations came under Whistler's top down responsibility for the entire undertaking. General George Washington Cullom, whom Abraham Lincoln appointed superintendent of West Point, gave this account of George Washington Whistler's work in Russia. As no skilled labor, machinery, nor equipment for railroad construction existed in the country, Whistler had to devise or send to the United States for engines, cars, pile drivers, bridge models, spike machinery, and tools of almost every kind, with workmen experienced in their use, capable superintendents of machine shops, bridge builders, contractors, and heads of almost every department of construction had to be imported from America or England. One of Whistler's American steam pile drivers with 3 laborers in an hour did the work which one of the Russian hand drivers required 16 men during 2 whole days to perform. Whistler had to be constantly on the move and personally to direct vast and varied operations involving the construction of 200 locomotives, 6,000 cars, great bridges, numerous workshops, large depots, and numberless structures for various purposes in housing, feeding, and directing sometimes 60,000 mechanics and laborers. On New Year's Day of 1843, Whistler was for the first time presented at court. He, of course, appeared in the imperial presence with modesty yet self-possession, neither dazzled nor daunted by the splendor of the court or the awful majesty of the throne. Upon the emperor's invitation, Whistler, with much ease and earnestness, unfolded his plans for carrying out his great work, to which his majesty listened in the most complaisant manner. Quote, the emperor is a very fine-looking man, very much like General Scott, but the general never treated me with half the consideration that the emperor did. I told him that all I knew upon the points of his inquiries were I told him all I knew with as much ease as I could have talked to any private gentleman. I verily believe I never said your majesty once. I described to him the whole route of the road, its principal difficulties, and how they might be overcome. After Whistler worked 5 years, day and night, the Tsar visited the whole railway line and the workshops and then gave Whistler the Cross of the Order of St. Anne and, quote, to his Harrison, Winans, and Eastwick a diamond ring each. Whistler died in Russia of heart failure due to cholera in 1849 when the railway was almost complete. It was finished under his successor, Thompson S. Brown, graduate of the U.S. Military Academy class of 1825. Joseph Harrison Jr. wrote this about the work of his firm, which entirely relocated to Russia. Quote, Mr. Harrison went to St. Petersburg in the spring of 1843 and in connection with Mr. Thomas Winans of Baltimore, that's Winans, by the way. A contract was concluded with the government of Russia at the close of the same year for building 162 locomotives and iron trucks for 2,500 freight cars. The Alexandrovsk Mechanical Works had been established earlier to manufacture armaments. American railroad builders made it Russia's largest industrial factory. After the rail line was opened in 1851, Joseph Harrison returned to Philadelphia. 2 members of his firm remained in Russia on a contract, quote, for the repairs to the rolling stock of the St. Petersburg and Moscow Railroad, which continued until 1862. The British looked coldly upon this initiative, which threatened to Americanize this immense eastern country. They soon afterwards launched the Crimean War against Russia. American opinion was decidedly in Russia's favor. A diatribe written by the British intelligence operative Lawrence Oliphant just before that war mocked the special pride both Americans and Russians had for their own national progress, criticized Russian government tariff protection for developing industry, and then said, quote, Russian railroads seem to be meant for Russian soldiers, And it is the facility thus afforded of moving large bodies of men that invests this mode of communications in Russia with an importance which does not attach to it in Great Britain, or perhaps any other country in Europe, to an equal extent. When St. Petersburg, Moscow, Odessa, and Warsaw become connected, Russia assumes an entirely new position with regard to the rest of Europe. A few days instead of many months will then suffice to concentrate the armies of the north and south upon the Austrian or Prussian frontiers. Through this same quarter of the world, many hundreds of years ago, poured those barbaric hordes which overran civilized Europe. It would indeed be a singular testimony to the spirit of the age if the next invaders made their descent by means of railroads. Unquote. This is the traditional imperial hate propaganda, which today uses the trick phrase, quote, dual use technology. It implies that the West must not allow the less developed countries in Asia, the Mideast, Africa, or South America to acquire advanced technology. They must remain prone before imperial strength because they might use this power over nature to make threatening weapons. The Russians could certainly use railroads to move troops, though they built their lines with different gauge from that of the Western Europe to defend against invasion. But the Americans, heirs to their own revolution, knew that railroads were vital to defend Russian sovereignty, and Americans acted to create an anti imperial concert of modernizing sovereign nations. The new St. Petersburg Moscow Railway was in the north and could not be used for the war waged in the south. I'm talking about the Crimean War, of course. And that, hey, we're talking about Crimea, right? That's what we're talking about today. Fighting over Crimea as a proxy by Britain to keep America and Russia from working together. It's the same story, guys. The new St. Petersburg Moscow Railway was in the north and could not be used for the war waged in the south. Nicholas's son Alexander II became Tsar during the bloody 1853 to 56 war. He was so shocked at the British superiority and Russian backwardness that he moved his country rapidly into modern times, allying Russia with Abraham Lincoln and inviting in new American railway builders. Well, the next topic is Germany. Friedrich List, Building America and Germany. Well, Friedrich List is another one of the popular economists that is present in the LaRouche historical articles at EIR and other places. And he's somebody that, once again, is in favor of this American system whereby America will use its bountiful resources to improve mankind generally, and particularly to take care of its own sovereign needs and to be able then to help other countries and peoples. Well, that's the reading for this morning. Once again, I invite you to join us tonight. Follow Bill Taylor, who is now Will _Taylor _Jr. on Twitter, and follow all of his fascinating investigations into the connections of Gibson Island here in Maryland, an amazingly secret enclave of very, very important powerful elites and spies and Rockefellers and you name it. And he has a whole lot of new research to share with us tonight. Looking forward to seeing him and you all again at 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. Thank you very much. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. If you haven't supported us on Patreon, today's the last day of October, and you can make a pledge if you like by going to screamingospreys.com and press the Patreon button. And speaking of Screaming Ospreys, have a great afternoon. Thank you, everybody.